Hi, Ronan here. I'm a Solutions Engineering Manager with SmartBear. Today, I'd like to introduce you to our new video series, Reaching the Podium. The Paris Olympics have been a fantastic spectacle. Athletes have taken center stage, and many of them have fulfilled their goal of stepping onto the podium. Just like in the Olympics, however, competition in software development is also fierce. Every company wants to deliver flawless applications and stay ahead of their competitors. But how do you ensure your company's testing strategy is gold medal worthy? At SmartBear, we're your testing coaches. We can help you to elevate your testing practices, gain strategic advantages in the marketplace, deliver great experiences to your users, and to reach the top of the testing podium. So whether you're aiming for a bronze medal win in efficient testing or the coveted gold medal of a comprehensive test management strategy, we'll equip you with the winning techniques and tools that you need. We'll even show you how to harness the power of AI to take your testing to the next level. But don't take it from me. Use the on-screen links to access technical sessions designed to help you level up your testing game and get ready to pole vault over your competition.
Hi, my name is Joe Joyce, and I'm a solutions architect with SmartBear, and I'd like to welcome you to our video series on reaching the podium. And in this video series, myself and my colleagues on the solutions engineering team are going to be taking you through some practical steps that you can take right now to elevate your API design and testing processes to a level where you'll be reaching the podium and the gold medal spot with API design and testing. So today we'll be talking about the first level on the podium, the bronze level, and I'll be taking you through an example of, first of all, running an audit on your API landscape, finding out what APIs you have out in the wild today, and then taking that information and taking that data and converting it into OpenAPI specification files that you can use as documentation and resources for further collaboration with your consumers and providers. After that, we'll be creating a new version of one of our API design files and inviting other users to collaborate on it. So taking our first steps into a design first approach. And then after that, we'll be taking that API design and using it to create some simple initial functional tests that we can use to make sure that our API implementation is doing what it says on the tin. And with all that done, you will have enough in place to win that bronze medal when it comes to API design and testing. Before I jump in, if you'd like to learn any more about what I'm talking about today or any other SmartBear tools, just get in touch via your account manager if you're an existing user of SmartBear tools, or via our website if you're new to the SmartBear solutions. So with that said, let's dive in and find out how you can win that bronze medal.
So here at SmartBear, we are big proponents of the design first approach to API development, meaning that before you write any implementation code, you start with an API design, which is essentially a blueprint of the interface. And when you're just starting off on your journey to the top of the API podium, it's likely that you have a lot of APIs that were developed code first, so implemented first without any design or documentation established for them. So SwaggerHub Explorer, which is a SmartBear tool, can be very helpful in this scenario because you can use Explorer to interact with an existing API that may have been developed without any API design document or OpenAPI spec file. And by interacting with the API by sending requests to various endpoints and adding those interactions to spaces, which are just collections of API requests within Explorer, you can take an API that was essentially undocumented and generate an OpenAPI spec file for it. And this is useful because it means that you can now move towards an API design first process for this API that was initially code first. And there's lots of benefits to the API design first process, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But from an Explorer perspective, what you have now is a collection of requests that you've performed in the tool, and you can export those requests and responses and any of the the data that was contained in the API requests and transactions and export them to SwaggerHub as an API. And SwaggerHub is SmartBear's API design and documentation tool. And all we have to do here is specify a few attributes, specify the owner of the API and the visibility of the API, hit confirm, and that's going to bring us into SwaggerHub. If we click on this button here, we now have an open API design for that API that was initially code first. So this is useful for a number of reasons. We now have version 1 of our API, which is essentially already published because we were just interacting with it in a particular environment. So we can change this version 1 to read only because it's published. But what we might do next is start to move towards design first by creating a new version of our API. And let's say this is just going to be a minor change. So we'll up the version number here, keep the visibility as private, and create our new version. So now we have a new version of our API design, which we can use to start. Maybe we want to add a new endpoint, or maybe we want to add some new operations or parameters. With design first, the idea is that anytime an API needs to change, the change should happen in the API design first. And ideally, it should happen in a way that is collaborated on by other share or stakeholders in the API design and development process. And one of the great things about SwaggerHub is that you can add these users as collaborators. So this could be different individuals, other designers or testers, which you can invite here as individual members. Or if you're using the SwaggerHub Teams functionality, you can invite an entire team directly to the API. And this just means you can start to collaborate on the API design by adding new information, leaving comments, suggestions, things like that. And the point of all of this is that it's usually easier to fix an issue with an API when you're still in the design phase and we're just dealing with a YAML file, rather than waiting until we've actually implemented some of the code and we have to now go ahead and refactor and debug that code and run our tests again. So these are some of the benefits of the design first approach, and how you interact with them or get the benefit of them in SwaggerHub. It's all about creating new versions of an API and adding collaborators and starting to put that design first process in place. And those are two things you can do in SwaggerHub to start moving towards the bronze level of API design and development. But it doesn't stop there in terms of what you can do at this level to improve the API design and development process. And while we've been in SwaggerHub so far, what I want to do now is talk about other things that we can do with the API design file now that we have it created for this new version of the API. So having an API design spec file is useful not just for designers and developers, but it's useful for testers as well. Because if a tester has this resource available to them, the API spec file, they can start to generate test cases and assets that they can run in the testing phase of the lifecycle just based off the API design. So a tester doesn't necessarily have to wait until the API has been implemented or deployed to a particular environment. And how that works from a SmartBear perspective is we bring in another tool called ReadyAPI. And ReadyAPI is SmartBear's API testing platform. So it's a desktop application, a little bit different to SwaggerHub and SwaggerHub Explorer. So it's not a SaaS tool. You would run it on a machine, like a desktop machine or workstation, but it integrates with SwaggerHub. And how it integrates is when you create a new project in ReadyAPI, one of the first things that you're prompted to do is to import an API definition. And this is the file that we've generated from Explorer and just versioned in SwaggerHub. And we're now going to import that into ReadyAPI and start creating some tests out of it. And when you have the SwaggerHub integration set up, it's easy to search for an existing API. And we can see here version 1 and version 1.1, which is the new version we created. So we can pull that version in to ReadyAPI. And when it's imported, we'll see the endpoints created here that we can now use to generate some tests. And it's very easy to do this in ReadyAPI. It's a matter of right-clicking on the name of the API, We'll generate a test suite. We don't have a test suite created already, so ReadyAPI is going to create one for us. We can choose here whether we want one test case for each resource or endpoint, or do we want a single test case that has one request for each method? So that's up to you. I'm going to go with a single test case with one request for each method here. We also have the option to create a load test, but we're not going to do that now. We'll leave that till a later stage of our Podium journey. And we'll just call this API test suite. So you can see now underneath the functional test node, we've got a test case, we've got some requests that we can start sending to our API. And we can do that by clicking the send button up here. See the response on the right-hand side of the user interface. I just sent that request manually through the UI, but as we'll talk about a little bit later on in the series, you can automate this process as well. But at this point, while we're still at the bronze level of the Podium, the last thing I want to add to my workflow are some assertions. And assertions are really checkpoints that you can add to the responses of your API requests to make sure that they meet certain criteria, like the fact that they contain a particular token or piece of data, or that they comply with certain standards like HTTP status codes that you create a list of, or Swagger compliance assertion will check to make sure that the transaction matches the schema that was used to create the tests. So if I go for the HTTP status codes assertion here, and let's say I want to make sure that this response always contains a 200, which in this case it does, I'll see my assertion has passed. So very quickly you create a test that has passing and failing criteria based off the OpenAPI definition that you brought in from your previous steps. So over the last 5 or 10 minutes, what we've done is taken an API that was code first and deployed to a particular environment. We used Explore to generate an OpenAPI spec file from that API and import it into SwaggerHub. In SwaggerHub, we created a new version of the API for some new interface functionality, and we added some collaborators to contribute to the design of this API, so moving towards a design-first methodology. And then finally, we passed that OpenAPI, the new version of our OpenAPI design, to our QA team in ReadyAPI, and they were able to take in the OpenAPI file and create some test cases out of it. And this process doesn't have to take a long time. With SmartBear tools, it's very simple to get this up and running, as we've just seen, within a matter of minutes. So hopefully this was an enjoyable introduction. Once you've gone through this process, you'll have reached what we consider to be bronze level in your API design and development journey. But if you'd like to move on to the silver and gold levels, then stay tuned for future episodes of the Podium series. And with that, bye for now.
Hi, my name's Adrian Minnock, and I'm a solutions engineer here at SmartBear. In the previous Podium video, we showed how you could send requests using the SwaggerHub Explorer tool, and then we reused those requests to create an API definition within SwaggerHub. We were then able to use the API definition within SwaggerHub and pull this into ReadyAPI in order to create and run our functional tests on the API. In this silver level video, we're going to show you how we can use the API definition in SwaggerHub, and we're going to add design time standardization to the API definition. And we're also going to be able to push our API definition and code templates to a Git repo. We're then going to look at ReadyAPI, where we're going to be able to build and run a data-driven end-to-end API testing workflow. And then once we have this created, we're also going to be able to push this to the same Git repo. So now we will have both our tests and our API specs and code templates, all in the same space. See you then.
Hi everyone. In the previous bronze level video, we would have shown how we could send our API requests using SwaggerHub Explorer, and then use these requests to create an API definition and pull that into SwaggerHub. Now in this video, we're going to look at how we can use that same API definition. We're going to have a look at the design approaches that are available within SwaggerHub. we're going to be able to add some design time standardization, and then we will push this to our Git repo. So to get started here, we can just select our API definition that we used previously. And this is just using a very basic payees API definition where we could send a get request, post request, and a delete request. Now, I've added a new version to this API definition, and I've added some parameters and operation IDs. So I've just made some slight changes and created a new version here. Now, within SwaggerHub, we can change the API definition or create new APIs using either the code editor, or we can use the form editor, which will give a nice alternative to maybe some users that aren't as comfortable or familiar using the YAML or aren't as comfortable with the OpenAPI spec. So from here, we can add new operations, we can add parameters, requests, responses, all from the form editor or the visual editor. But again, we can jump between both approaches here very easily within SwaggerHub. Now, if we want to have a look at adding some design time standardization to ensure that maybe we have some design rules that we want everybody in the organization to follow, we can add them here within SwaggerHub. So if we select the organization, we can choose the standardization section here. This will give us a few different approaches to add standardization rules. So we have the ability to import spectral rules here. We can also add some public style guides that are available. And we have some default rules already available from SmartBear. Now, if we have a look here, we do also have the ability to create our own custom rules, which can be very, very beneficial, because it'll give us a nice easy way here of being able to create a rule, add it to our organization, and then do our checks as we're designing the APIs. So in this example here, we can give the rule a name. We can add the severity, so whether it's going to be a blocker or just a warning. We can choose the path, and then we can choose what we're actually going to be testing for. So as you can see, we have multiple options here. In this example, I'm just going to be testing for the casing within this path, and I'm going to be looking for a camel case. So I want to ensure that all of my operation IDs are following camel case. And we can see if this is working here by pulling in an API definition. So I can select my payees API. We can then see here all of the operation IDs because it's going to navigate to the path that we've selected. And we can see one of the operation IDs here for our post request isn't following camel case. And that's why it's showing up here as an error. But this will show us that the rule is working correctly. And then it will alert us to any failures that we have within SwaggerHub for this rule. And if we go back and just test this, we can see here that we have an error. So we know that there are some standardization errors here. And if we open this up, it'll tell us the line where the error is happening and what rule it's breaking. Okay, so now that we've added some design time standardization, what we're going to do now is add an integration to a Git repository and push our API definitions to that location. In order to do this, we can select the name of the API. We can add an integration here from the top of the screen, and we can set up an integration here. So I have one set up with GitHub, but as you can see, we have multiple integrations available here. So if I select my GitHub integration, we can give it a name, just make sure we have the connection available. We can select the repo that we're going to be pushing to, and then we can choose the branch, what documentation we want to push. We can give the output folder a name. So I'll just call it API definition. And then we also give the output file as well. So we can push our API definitions here. We can push code templates. and we can also push the HTML documentation formats. So whatever you want to push. Once we save and execute this, we can now jump into the Git repo and we can see that we now have our API definition. So we now have our API definition folder, and within that, we have our API definition itself. So that's just showing that the integration with SwaggerHub and GitHub has been executed successfully. And now what we're going to do is have a look at how we can create our end-to-end API testing projects and push this to the same location as our API definitions. So if we now have a look at ReadyAPI, we can have a look at the payee project. So we would have previously in the last video used our API definition from SwaggerHub, moved it into ReadyAPI, and created some functional tests. Now, what I've done in ReadyAPI in this silver level video is that I've now created an end-to-end testing workflow for my APIs. So if we have a look here, we have a test case and we have a data source. So the data source will allow us to data drive our tests. Instead of manually entering in different values, we can now pull in data maybe from an Excel spreadsheet or a database, and we can loop through that data very, very quickly. We've also now have a workflow where we have a get request, an update, and a delete request. So what we're going to be doing is passing values between those different steps as well. Now, if we look at the data-driven test first, what we can do is select whatever source you want to pull your data in from. I'm using a data generator, which will allow me to use randomized values, so randomized numbers in this example. However, we can use, as I mentioned, Excel spreadsheets, CSV files, databases, or any of the other file types available here. So to use the data from a data source, we can very easily just select the field, choose Get Data, and then this pop-up screen will appear. So this is where we can use data from a data source, but we can also reuse values from other requests. So I can select my data source here, I can select the ID, and as you can see, ReadyAPI builds out the expression for you. So no need for scripting. Now, if we have a response here from an API request, and we want to reuse some of this data in a following request, what we can do is select the request here. Now we can reuse, if this is going to be for parameters, if it's going to be in the body of a request, we can use both options. But if I wanted to, for instance, use the account name from a previous request, we can just select wherever you want to use it. Again, we choose Get Data. We can choose the first request here, and then we just choose the field that we want to reuse. So I can choose the account name, and ReadyAPI again just builds out that expression for us, makes it very easy where there's not a reliance on scripting needed here. So we can have personas of different, I suppose, levels of kind of scripting or coding knowledge can all use ReadyAPI to build out their API functional tests. Now that we have our end-to-end workflow created here in ReadyAPI, what we can now do is push this API project to a Git repo. So in order to push this to a Git repo, we would be able to select our project. We can connect to a Git repo here. So I have a connection already made. Again, I can disconnect this. We can connect to the Git repo. We select what repo we want to connect to. So again, I'm going to use the same API design and test repo. And then once we open up the Git panel on the top of the screen, we will be able to do pull requests, commit any changes that we have here. And we can also push our project to our Git repo. So if we execute this here, we'll be able to see that our project has now been successfully pushed to the Git repo. And now if we have a look at this, we'll be able to update the repo, and we can now see that this also contains our ReadyAPI composite project here as well. So now that we've used SwaggerHub for our internal design process, and we've also used ReadyAPI for creating our end-to-end testing workflows, we might now want to make our API definitions available to consumers. In order to do that, we can use the SwaggerHub portal, which is a documentation portal that will allow us to easily connect and reuse our API definitions from SwaggerHub. So in this example here, I have my documentation portal, so my SwaggerHub portal here, and we can see that we have a list of different products available. And a product within the portal here would just be a grouping of API definitions and also some documentation or markdown files describing how the APIs work and how they integrate. So if we open up one of these projects, so I'm going to open up my FinTech API, we can have a look and we can see here we have different pages, so overview pages, getting started with the APIs, authentication processes. We can have different levels available here. So it's quite flexible on how you document your APIs for consumers. But what we can also do here is link our API definitions from SwaggerHub directly to the portal. So if I wanted to now link my Payee API that we used in SwaggerHub earlier, all I would need to do is go to the provider view. So go into the backend here. I can use my FinTech or go into my FinTech API. And then we can link any API definitions that we want. So for instance, if I wanted to link the Payee API from SwaggerHub, I would just add a page or link APIs. So I'm going to link an API. I can very quickly select my Payee API here. We can choose the version that we want to link. Then that's it. It's now linked within the portal. So we can have multiple versions linked. We can have different APIs linked. We can add additional documentation now to describe how the API is going to work and interact. And once we publish this, we'll now be able to view this within the portal. And again, we can jump between the live view and a preview option here to see how this looks. So now when we jump into the preview mode, we're going to be able to see our new Payee API available now for consumers within the SwaggerHub portal. This now means that we no longer just have our APIs available internally, but we now have easy to use walkthrough guides available for consumers using the SwaggerHub portal. Thank you for watching.
Hi, I'm Martin Keneally, and I'm a solutions engineer here with SmartBear. Congratulations on your work so far to achieve bronze and silver levels in your API design, documentation, and testing. Now, I am going to get you to that gold level by showing you how you can incorporate those learnings into your automation workflows. I will discuss how you can integrate SmartBear's API tools into your CI/CD processes. I will show you a range of different APIs and CLIs that you can use to do a range of programmatic things like run validation checks on your API design, execute functional tests, and add an API into SwaggerHub portal. Finally, I will introduce contract testing into the equation by publishing an API into Packflow. See you then.
Great effort so far in the work you have put into those bronze and silver levels in reaching the podium with SmartBear's API tools. In this gold level session, I'm going to take you through how you can integrate those SmartBear API tools into your automation workflow. Now, one new tool that I will introduce into the equation is Packflow. Packflow is SmartBear's comprehensive contract testing platform. So if you're not aware, contract testing focuses on validating the communication between microservices by specifying inputs and outputs of a service. Now, contract testing is there to ensure that a provider is compatible with the expectations that a consumer has of it. In Packflow, there is a feature called bidirectional contract testing, which is a type of static contract testing, where two contracts, one representing the consumer expectations and another representing the provider's capability, are compared to ensure they are compatible. In this instance, we have our consumer contract, the expectations it has of the provider, uploaded into Packflow, and the provider expectation will be that open API definition that we're working with. And when we have that done and done our contract testing, we're going to publish that contract into SmartBear SwaggerHub's portal. Okay, so we'll start off by getting a couple things set up. Okay, we're going to need a few keys, all right, our API keys, okay, to be used for our CLIs and our API calls. Okay, so in SwaggerHub, you can get the API key from under your user profile details. Under Packflow, you can get under the settings section, so you'll need your read-write token and your base URL. And for running our ReadyAPI tests, we're going to take our access key from the SmartBear License Manager, which you can get under your settings. So depending on the SCM tool that you're working with, you will be able to store those as secrets into your settings, into your project. So to start off, I've set up some environmental variables, okay, related to SwaggerHub and Packflow. So they could be names of the API, the org. So the first step after we've implemented or installed our prerequisites is to validate the API on SwaggerHub. So that means installing SwaggerHub's CLI and running some commands. Okay, the first command we're going to run is the API get, okay, which is going to see that our API exists. The second command we'll run is the API validate, and that's going to check that SwaggerHub has, if it has any outstanding standardization issues that need to be reviewed. Okay, so if validation check fails, then we don't want our pipeline to continue to run. Okay, so that was one of a number of types of checks you can implement with the CLI. So if you see here, we've made a change, we've raised a standardization error, and what will happen now is when we run our command line, we will be able to reach out to SwaggerHub and check for those standardization errors. So in this session, I'm going to be running these workflows manually just to be able to walk through them. Okay, so our pipeline has been triggered. Let's zoom in. Okay, so we've installed our prerequisites. And in the next step, we're going to reach out to SwaggerHub, check that the API exists to CLI call, and then validate the API for any standardization errors. Now, these checks can be made through, again, to a CLI call, or there's also an API behind SwaggerHub, the registry API. And all this information you can find on our documentation. So we'll click into this job. Okay, we see that the CLI has been installed. There's a check to ensure that the API definition exists in SwaggerHub and the validation operation has been executed. And we can see we have a standardization error coming back in the console. And that is the exact same that we see to the SwaggerHub UI. So as simple as that, you can put those checks into the API before you actually start building your services. Okay, it could be part of your build processes. Okay, so if we go back into the pipeline again, we'll look at the next items on the agenda. Okay, so the build and run API service will be how you build and run your API service. And then we're going to run our functional tests through ReadyAPI. Okay, so a couple of steps you will take is to download ReadyAPI onto the agent, onto the VM, make that executable, and install ReadyAPI on the fly. Okay, this is again one approach you can take. Then we're going to run our ReadyAPI functional tests, okay, to this command line format. Okay, this is going to detail the environments we want to run against, the reports we want to generate, and where the actual project is. So we have pushed our ReadyAPI project into the Git repository, okay, so we can access it directly from here. So one way of generating that command line for use is to go into ReadyAPI, right-click on a project or a test suite, and launch the test runner. Now, this will allow you to specify the kind of reports you want to generate, the kind of tags you need, and generate a command line. So you can take this command line, copy it into your pipeline, and just do the necessary modifications. Okay, the path to the project, the location of the test runner. Once we have that done, we're going to publish the API into Packflow. Okay, and this will then be compared against our consumer contract that we've already seen. So we can run the packed CLI through a Docker command, and then run the Docker command to push the OpenAPI contract into Packflow. Okay, providing the provider name, the app version, the branch that this build is on. Okay, and you will provide verification results to ensure that the provider has been tested, like we've done with ReadyAPI. Once that is done, we're going to run our can I deploy command. Okay, and this is used as part of an application deployment to check if there's been a successful verification. So this successful verification happens between existing application versions and the application versions you're about to deploy. Okay, so a successful can I deploy check indicates that the application being deployed is compatible with any application it integrates with. And finally, we're going to set the API to be published on SwaggerHub. So that means it'll put it into a read-only mode. And then once we've done that through the CLI call, we will publish the API or link the API into SwaggerHub portal through an API call. Again, all these commands and all this information is available throughout SmartBear's documentation and the various tools. So let's get this workflow running, and we can step through the different operations and the different outcomes of these jobs. Okay, so we're going to run the workflow. So quickly, it's installed the prerequisite, it's validated the API in SwaggerHub, it's built and run our API service. Now, next thing it's going to do is going to run those ReadyAPI functional tests that you've already built and pushed to your Git repository. So in this instance, I'm installing ReadyAPI throughout the job. Okay, and you can see here the ReadyAPI functional tests are being executed through the command line. You can see all our tests have passed, and it's generated a report for us, which we could push into Packflow as part of the verification of the provider. So with Packflow, back to this again, into our Packflow step, we've published the OpenAPI to Packflow. So our PayYE provider now is within Packflow. And if we go into Packflow, we will be able to see that. Okay, so now we can see that if we view our contracts, our provider contract has been uploaded into Packflow, and we see our verification has been successful. Okay, that means when we run our can I deploy feature, it will allow our integration or application to be deployed into whatever environment you've set up. Okay, so once we refresh, we will see that SwaggerHub now has been set to read only, as it's been published. And once we go into SwaggerHub portal, we should see that the API has now been linked into our SwaggerHub portal product. And there it is. So this goal level session will help you build out these automation workflows, whatever parts of the tooling you want to implement, and get that kind of integrated into your CI/CD processes. It's great going through this with you today. Hope you found it useful, and we will talk again soon.